Subcommittee on Oversight, Management, and Accountability will now come to order. And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. I'm going to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. We're here to discuss a topic that's becoming all too familiar to many of us at every part of this nation, that is domestic terrorism. From the hostage situation at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, earlier this year, to the radically motivated shooting at a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, to just the last month, many attacks have devastated our communities across the country. In response, the Secretary of Homeland Security recently launched a new urgent review to assess the department's capabilities to address this rising threat. And we're here today to discuss one of those capabilities in depth. Key piece of the Department of Homeland Security's toolbox has been the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, or TVTP. Since 2011, the department has identified the need to partner with local communities to address the growing domestic terrorism threat. In 2016, DHS launched the Countering Violent Extremism Grant Program, a predecessor to the current TVTP program. However, weak management of that early grant program undermined Homeland Security's ability to determine the effectiveness of the funding, and concerns about the inherent anti-Muslim bias in some of that program-funded projects eroded trust with minority communities. It is local community leaders who are in the best position to know when and how to engage with a vulnerable individual, and ensuring the department maintains trust with local communities has to be a top priority. In 2020, DHS relaunched the program under the new TVTP name with a new public health focus approach. Through this new grant funding program, DHS supports the efforts of local partners who seek to raise awareness about the domestic violent extremism threat and develop community-based networks to provide support to individuals who may be radicalized or radicalizing to violence before the crimes are actually committed. Our witnesses today represent 4 of the organizations that have received TVTP grants in either fiscal year 2020 or fiscal year 2021 grant cycles. The projects executed over a period of 2 years represent the wide variety of violence prevention efforts that are funded by this program. DHS has sought to support projects that implement promising practices, as well as those that propose to test new and innovative solutions to terrorism prevention. These projects fall into a number of categories, including enhancing threat assessment capabilities, challenging online mobilization narratives, and establishing or enhancing local prevention frameworks. The TVTP program has demonstrated some promising early results, but it's still relatively new, and although DHS has started the process to ensure an independent review of the efficacy of the projects funded in the 2020 grant cycle, that review is still not yet complete. Continued oversight of this program will be necessary to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated today. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how they have ensured the protection of privacy, civil rights, civil liberties in their work with individuals and local communities, as well as how they plan to measure the impact of their projects. It is of utmost importance that we get this right, and whatever we can do to curb these horrifying attacks, we must do immediately. With that, I thank you again for joining us today. And the chair would recognize the ranking member if he is here. Is he here?
Yes, I am, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear and see me?
Mr. Mayor, how are you? Welcome. Ready
Thank you,
for
sir.
your opening remarks, sir. Welcome.
Coming to you live off the floor. So, Chairman Correa, thank you for holding this important subcommittee hearing on the Department of Homeland Security's Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program And thank you so much to our witnesses for joining us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony about experiences that you've had with the program as grant recipients, and I'm particularly interested in learning about what you found to be the most effective and how you think this program might be able to responsibly grow and benefit a larger number of communities in the future. Over the years, the terrorism landscape has evolved, and while many grants focusing on terrorism prevention were created as a result of the 9/11 attacks, the current threat landscape has a combination of both international and domestic violence concerns. We must address and evolve our approach so that it is tackling these new and emerging threats and allocating federal dollars in the most effective way possible. I believe that we must do all we can to protect our communities and equip them with the tools they need to combat and prevent targeted violence and terrorism in whatever form it takes. The the TVTP grant program is one such tool that can help communities build and strengthen their resiliency capabilities and prevent threats before they arrive. Just last April, I co-led a letter to the House Appropriations Committee that was focusing on all of these various funding streams, asking them to increase funding in fiscal year 22 for the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, which is now operating as the Center for Preventative Partnerships and Programs, and the TVTP threat program itself. This letter highlighted the fact that in recent years, more Americans have been killed by domestic violent extremists than by international terrorism. And the number of domestic terrorism investigations conducted by the FBI has doubled since 2017. While threats from foreign terrorist organizations remain very real, these figures demonstrate that the landscape is changing, so too much must our thinking. Recently, our country has experienced increased rates of violence, ranging from heartbreaking mass shootings to an attempted assassination of a sitting Supreme Court justice. We must do more to combat violence and address its root causes, no matter the ideological motivation, so that our democracy is protected. Violence of any kind is unacceptable, and as elected leaders, it is our responsibility to find solutions that will promote and protect the safety of those we represent. The TVTP grant program has a great amount of potential to enhance these important efforts. At the same time, I think it's incumbent that we make sure this money is well spent. Simply spending more taxpayer dollars will not fix the problem. We must make sure that federal grant dollars are spent efficiently, with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. This grant program must be transparent and accountable to the American people, and it must ensure that civil liberties for all Americans are protected. As lead Republican on the Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee, I remain committed to working with my colleague, Chairman Correa, to help strengthen the security of our local communities and to bolster and improve DHS programs designed to achieve this goal. It is imperative that we continue to advance bipartisan efforts to increase funding, accessibility, and resources to programs that enhance the safety and security of communities around this country. Targeted violence and terrorism can occur anywhere at any time, and we must remain committed to empowering local leaders and local law enforcement to strengthen this resiliency and ensure DHS has the proper funding to support their efforts. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on the importance of the TVTP grant program, the ways in which they have used these grant awards to protect their communities, and any recommendations that they have to improve the program going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Ranking Member Mayor, I couldn't agree with you more. The mission to protect American lives from terrorism, very important mission. We have to make sure that every taxpayer dollar we invest in this mission is optimal. Thank you very much, sir. Members are reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. And without objection, members not on the subcommittee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. And now I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, we have Dr. Kurt Braddock, an assistant professor, School of Communication at American University. His research focuses on persuasive strategies used by violent extremist groups to recruit and radicalize audiences targeted by their propaganda. Dr. Braddock also explores how theories of communication, persuasion, and social influence can be used to inform practices meant to prevent radicalization among the vulnerable audiences. Second witness, Ms. Humaira Khan, the president and founder of the Move Flahoun, a think tank specializing in preventing radicalization and domestic violence extremism. She has also served as co-investigator for the Department of Defense's Minerva Research Institute project on terrorist propaganda, as well as strategic advisor to the UN Security Council managing the Countering Violent Extremism portfolio. And our third witness, Mr. Paul Kim, a deputy district attorney with the LA District Attorney's Office, where he has served for over 25 years. Mr. Kim currently works with the Hate Crimes Unit within the Organized Crime Division. Our final witness is Lieutenant Colonel Chris Kalensky, Commander of Field Support Bureau and Deputy Director of the Michigan State Police. He is responsible for strategic leadership for the Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division and Intelligence Operations Division, which includes the state of Michigan's Fusion Center. And without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. And I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Braddock. Welcome, sir.
Mr. Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Mayor, thank you for having me here today. Members of the committee, thank you for having me to testify in relation to DHS's Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, formerly TVTP. As Chairman Correa said, I'm Assistant Professor of Public Communication at American University, where I'm also a faculty fellow at a research center focusing primarily on domestic extremism and terrorism called the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. Between these two appointments, I work at the intersection of communication and violent extremism, where I try to understand how communication influences people to engage in violent activities on behalf of ideologies that we see both domestically and internationally. My work in this area really stems from the events of September 11th, 2001, which really instilled in me a drive to find ways and understand why people could engage in such evil and find ways academically to protect Americans from this kind of violence. To this end, for the last 20 years, I've studied violent Islamic jihadists, violent extremists from the far left and the far right, Irish Republican dissident groups, lone actor terrorists, violent animal rights activists, single issue terrorists, Christian extremists, and every other extremist you can find. I sit in front of you today to discuss my unique experience with the CP3 program. At present, this program, or my research, is intended to understanding disinformation and conspiracies perpetuated by far-right extremists and their intended audiences, and more importantly, how we can prevent those audiences from engaging in violence in support of that disinformation and those conspiracies. I focus on the far right in this project because I know how important it is for the US government to use its budgets efficiently, getting the most value for every dollar spent. To that end, I sought to develop a project that addresses what all data show to be the most significant threat to domestic American security at the moment, far-right violent extremists. Stated most simply, I want to get you all the most bang for your buck. I'm glad to say that to date, this project's been a relative success, resulting in multiple deliverables for CP3, as well as a large workshop attended by some of the foremost experts in right-wing extremism and disinformation. I hope that my work continues to be of use for DHS in this regard. Excuse me. From the outset of this project, the CP3 program, formerly TVTP, has been very enthusiastic and supportive of any research that I've done. Personnel at CP3, some of which I'll mention by name later, have been in constant contact with me throughout my work and have sought to help me address logistic problems associated with my research at every turn. One specific challenge that I ran into in the early goings of the project was related to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which limited the degree to which I can meet collaborators, research participants, or other colleagues face to face. Despite the challenges posed by the pandemic and the limitations it put on my research, CP3 continued its support by facilitating the completion of deliverables that could be worked on without face-to-face contact. Some of these include the development of training modules for stakeholders that help them build resilience to disinformation within their communities, as well as training modules for those who would train others to help build this resilience. After COVID protocols were sufficiently lifted, we were able to hold the in-person workshop on understanding disinformation and future threats, one of the themes of which was a focus on LGBTQ plus communities, which, as we saw just a couple of days ago, does seem to be a target of the far right, or at least some elements of it. I understand my role here today will be to testify in more detail about my experiences with CP3 to gauge its value for the American people. To this end, I offer my full endorsement thus far. Not only has the program funded a range of research that addresses a variety of threats facing the country, it also demands accountability. Very few research programs require measures of program effectiveness to the degree that CP3 does. Because of this, the field is rife with pundits that pose as professionals. Prominent media figures, Twitter experts, and backseat driver pundits have long commented on the effectiveness of certain practices to reduce the risk of violence, but have provided no evidence to this effect. CP3 doesn't allow for this kind of fast and loose commentary. If only for CP3's demands for research accountability and proof of intervention effectiveness, I believe the program provides excellent value. But before turning to your questions to provide further detail about my project, I want to thank by name on the record John Wilder of CP3. He's been my program manager, and with my project, he's been a godsend on coordinating, organizing, and demanding accountability on my part for why my project is being effective. With that, I look forward to your questions, and I will also apologize in advance if you hear my dog tapping around during my testimony. I think he just wants to be part of the congressional record. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Braddock, and your dog's comments on the congressional record will be accepted without objection.
They're not worth it.
And testimony. And now I recognize Ms. Khan to summarize her statement in 5 minutes. Welcome, Ms. Khan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Meyer, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about the DHS Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program. My name is Humaira Khan. I'm the president and co-founder of Muflihun, and we are an independent resource center at the nexus of society, security, and technology. To prevent domestic terrorism and targeted violence in a country, it's essential we focus on, one, raising awareness of the threat and using a public health approach as the solution for violence prevention, but two is the allocation of resources by federal, state, and local governments to mitigate risk factors and enhance protective factors for primary prevention of violence. So Muflihun was actually the recipient of 2 DHS FY 2020 TVTP grants, and that focus on these 2 areas. One was for an upstander training branded Tackle to raise awareness, and the second was an innovation grant called the Community Resilience Early Warning System, CRUISE, for primary prevention of domestic terrorism and targeted violence. So CRUISE is a data-informed platform to help mayors, county executives, city managers, and locally elected leaders prioritize risk and protective factors specific to their jurisdictions and to allocate budgets aligned with the needs of their local prevention frameworks. CRUISE uses publicly available open source data of society and community level risk and protective factors at the national, state, and local levels. It does not use any individual level information, nor is there any personally identifiable information, PII, in the platform. So we are grateful to DHS for funding this innovative approach and to our 4 pilot locations for their commitment to protecting communities. And our preliminary analysis has focused on hate crimes and domestic terrorism. And over the next few weeks, we will be completing our initial analysis for mass casualty shootings and school shootings. And after our analysis is finalized and in partnership with the stakeholders, we will be recommending priorities for steering limited resources to build local prevention frameworks. And we'll be conducting briefings and capacity building workshops at each pilot location to facilitate multi-stakeholder partnerships based on their specific needs. In 2020, Muflihun also got the DHS TVTP grant for the Tackle Upstander training, and that was implemented in partnership with the American Jewish Committee, AJC. And that training curriculum includes awareness of the threat of targeted violence and domestic terrorism, understanding how hate and bigotry can incite violence, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Black racism, and anti-Asian hate, the role of communities in violence prevention, and the role of engaged upstanders in recognizing when individuals are experiencing distress and knowing what to do in these situations. And the participants from 12 states included elected officials, district attorneys, human rights commissioners, school safety officers, superintendents, county emergency management directors, and law enforcement. So the implementation of our 2 TVTP grants over the last 18 months has resulted in several learnings, right? And based on that, we will recommend, 1, 20 million of grant funding per year is stretched thin over our whole country. It's inadequate. Grant funding levels should be increased multiple fold. 2, Greater attention should be given to increasing awareness levels by encouraging the scaling of capacity building programs such as TACO and other similar initiatives. 3, the regional prevention coordinators are one of the greatest assets of DHS. They're experienced professionals, they're an invaluable resource for the grantees and for the local stakeholders alike. But there's not enough of them. There needs to be at least one RPC per state, if not more. And while number 4 is, while DHS is adding members to its team, there's still a gap for more technically qualified staff with subject matter expertise that is aligned with the public health approach. And 5 is data-informed analysis facilitates improved decision-making. And DHS should utilize data in its selection of future grants by matching data-informed needs of geographic locations to the proposed solutions at state and local levels. So let me end by emphasizing that we must accelerate our prevention efforts with increased resource allocation and not be discouraged by the mistakes of the past. And we cannot wait for another Tree of Life synagogue attack or Charleston's EME church attack or the Buffalo supermarket killings or the Uvalde school massacre before we decide to allocate resources towards primary prevention. Thank you again for your attention and for the opportunity to share Muflihun's experiences and perspectives. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Khan, and I recognize Mr. Kemp to summarize his statement in 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Mayor, and distinguished members of this committee. My name is Paul Kim, and I am a Deputy District Attorney at the DA's office here in Los Angeles County. I'm currently assigned to the Hate Crimes Unit. I've been assigned here for about 8 years. The Hate Crimes Unit vertically prosecutes all serious hate crimes that happen within the County of Los Angeles, including any case that involves grave bodily injury or death, any case that is committed by an organized hate group, and any cases that are either complex in nature or require a seasoned deputy district attorney. In this capacity, my primary role is I'm a trial attorney. My secondary role is I do community outreach. I work closely with our partners, our community-based partners, ranging from the Jewish groups to the AAPI groups, and including members of the LGBT community as well. During the time that I was prosecuting hate crime cases, about 3 years ago, I came across an issue. I had a defendant that had committed a crime of violence against a member of the LGBTQ community here in Long Beach. And this had gone all the way up to the very highest levels at my office. And a disposition was reached to include 200 hours of community service. Obviously, our goal was to try to raise the defendant's awareness when it came to the LGBT community. When we reached out to one of our partners, one of our stakeholders, I was immediately asked, what did this individual do? And when I described what happened and I described the nature of the injury, what I was told by the director was, Mr. Kim, this individual has committed an act of violence and has seriously injured a member of our community. We don't desire to have him participate doing any community service with our members or on our property. Now, this posed a problem. And one of the things that we know is that hate is not innate. It's something that's learned. It's something that's acquired. Somewhere you learned to hate this group of people because of whatever characteristic it is that you were biased against. When we start with that point, and we also consider the penal code, California Penal Code 422.85, which suggests that whenever you place somebody on a grant of probation, you should engage in some sort of cultural sensitivity and awareness training. LA County didn't have an anti-bias program. One day, when I was doing community outreach with the Museum of Tolerance, I was on a call with the LA City Attorney's Office, who was working with the Museum of Tolerance, who was also a TVTP awardee on their one-to-one program, which is a 15-hour coaching program. At that time, I met Michael Brown, who is the Deputy Director of Field Operations. And I reached out to Mr. Brown after I heard his talk, and he mentioned that there was a grant available. So I told him I would like to apply for the grant. I told him there was a need in the county, specifically when it came to trying to address the bias-motivated violence that caused the individual to target whoever it was for whatever crime was committed. Mr. Brown encouraged me to apply. It was the first time I had applied. It was, in fact, the first time that LADA had applied for a federal grant. We had previously applied for local grants, state grants, but never a federal grant. And at this point, I must echo Dr. Braddock. John Wilder is also my program analyst, and he has been incredibly helpful when it comes to helping us get the basics of this program done. The program is threefold. One, we want to focus on counseling. We're having one of our subrecipients is a Gateways Hospital Mental Health Center. They're going to have a clinician that's going to be working for 80 hours, 40 individual and 40 hours a group, trying to see if they can determine what the roots of the bias animus are and where they came from. Secondly, we're going to be working with a community-based organization called Second Call. Second Call does re-entry for former felons, and they're going to be acting as professional facilitators, and they're going to be acting as coaches in helping with the anti-bias portion of the program. And finally, we're working with 3 strands to develop an anti-bias program, an anti-bias curricula that can be used for any category of bias once it's created. I think that the CP3 program is really amazing. And I think that what it's going to permit us to do is to develop 2 things. One, an offender-centric study, not a very large one, but an offender-centric one. And 2, the tools and the modules that are necessary to try to address explicit bias. I look forward to the questions, and I thank you for inviting me to participate. Thank you.
Mr. Kim, thank you very much for your testimony. Now I'd like to recognize Lieutenant Colonel Kolensky to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. Welcome, Colonel.
Thank you, Chairman Correa, Ranking Member Meyer, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for allowing me to discuss the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Chris Kolensky, and I'm the Deputy Director in charge of the Field Support Bureau of the Michigan State Police, or MSP. And in this role, I oversee MSP's Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division, as well as the Intelligence Operations Division, among other areas. MSP was awarded a grant of $451,255 from the fiscal year 2021 DHS Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program. And today I'll be discussing how we are using this important federal support. Too many times in recent years, we have experienced incidents across our great nation where individuals have targeted others and committed acts of violence leading to far too many senseless deaths. The Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant is a tool that is helping us in Michigan to hopefully prevent these incidents before they occur by establishing a regional behavioral threat assessment management team and a statewide fusion liaison officer program. Our behavioral threat assessment management team consists of multidisciplinary and multi-jurisdictional partners who identify individuals who are on a pathway to violence and intervene by providing them with productive alternative outcomes. The statewide fusion liaison officer program includes law enforcement, first responders, and private sector partners across Michigan who will enhance awareness and strengthen collaboration and information sharing to aid in preventing targeted acts of violence. We recognize the need to develop behavioral threat assessment management capability in our state to ensure prevention frameworks are adopted that will allow local stakeholders to participate in communications addressing radicalization to violence. To address our behavioral threat assessment management gap within the terrorism prevention and targeted violence framework, we're developing one regional concept behavioral threat assessment management team that covers 3 counties. These 3 counties include the seat of state government and the state capital of Michigan, have a combined total population of just under 500,000 people, and are comprised of both urban and rural communities. This behavioral threat assessment management team will serve as a conduit to identify persons of concern who pose a threat of targeted violence and then provide referrals to independent programs as a form of prevention. This initial multidisciplinary team that this grant is helping to create is comprised of professionals from the local community who will collaborate to increase communications, develop protocols, and work with individuals who have risk factors of targeted violence and terrorism. Using our grant funds, we are hiring a specialist who will be on board within the next month who will be responsible for developing and managing the team. providing intervention and threat assessment training for team members, and for developing team protocols. A critical success factor for this program is having the funds to keep this specialist employed beyond the grant period, as this would provide communities with coordination, training, and confidence to identify at-risk individuals and respond with a coordinated community approach for successful targeted violence intervention and prevention. Future grant opportunities will help us to expand this regional concept team statewide. Additionally, through this grant and in partnership with the DHS CP3, we have recently begun to collaborate with Michigan State University School of Medicine and the National Policing Institute on a project that will train a highly skilled set of clinicians to be deployed across Michigan who will supplement the regional behavioral threat assessment teams by providing advanced care and safety or management plans for those most at risk for becoming radicalized towards acts of targeted violence. We are also sensitive to the protection of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties, which is why the privacy policy of the Michigan Intelligence Operations Center will be adhered to in all cases brought to the attention of the Behavioral Threat Assessment Management Team. Individuals associated with cases that pose a public safety risk will be treated with the same constitutional protections as any other individual encountered by law enforcement. The goals of the Fusion Liaison Officer Program are to provide training to increase awareness of targeted violence through outreach, community involvement, and intervention. As part of this grant, we received funding for 2 part-time contract analysts to assist with the delivery of Fusion Liaison Officer training, which is in-person training provided to law enforcement, first responders, and private sector personnel. This training seeks to increase awareness of the risk factors and radicalizations to violence process, strengthen strategic partnerships, and bolster information and intelligence sharing. To date, we have hired 1 of the 2 part-time contract analysts to assist the Fusion Liaison Officer Coordinator, finalize their educational materials, held a joint community awareness briefing with our CP3 partners that included 30 of our state intelligence members, and conducted 1 of the scheduled 10 training sessions. Once the initial groundwork is complete and a program established, the Fusion Liaison Officer Coordinator, who is a senior intelligence analyst in the Michigan State Police, will be capable of managing the program independently without the sustainment of the contract analyst beyond the grant performance period. Thank you for your time and this opportunity to share our experiences in Michigan. And at this time, I am happy to take any questions you may have for me.
Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Kolensky, for your testimony. I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony as well. I'll remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel, and I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of question. And my first question would go to Mr. Braddock and Ms. Khan. As you know, this TVTP grant program, it's essentially a 2-year cycle. Fiscal year 2020 just coming to a close. So question briefly, you can tell me what your programs are able to achieve over the last 2 years. Ms. Khan.
So we have 2 projects. I will cover both of them. So for crews, we have, we have 4 pilot locations who are committed to trying out this new approach of using data-informed analysis to support the primary prevention of violence. And we're very specifically working with them to help understand the risk and protective factors for the allocation of resources. So this is about working with them to develop the recommendations for their sites. And of course, all of this is based on the fact that we've actually built out the Cruise platform, which is bringing in open source data from the last 20 years from multiple government agencies to actually understand what is playing out in terms of risk factors and protective factors. For TACKLE, we have actually completed the TACKLE training program, and we have trained over 150 participants over 12 states. It was a virtual training. And after the TACKLE training, we have found that 86% of our participants agreed or strongly agreed that their self-perception is that they have the skills to prevent violence. So this was actually an increase of 37% just based on those 8 hours of training. And then similarly, we found that after the training, 73%, right, were actually willing to engage with a family or friend that they were concerned about. And that's an increase of over 20% in that. So we have, for TACKLE, we have completed all our grant requirements because we finished early. And we actually went above what we had promised. And for Cruise, it's ongoing, and we are now already sent the pilot locations the initial results, and we are working with them to develop the recommendations and see how they are doing their budgets and how they are building their partnerships.
Thank you. Mr. Braddock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this project was designed as a two-phase project, the first of which was meant to inform the second phase. Before I describe exactly what we've achieved so far, let me describe what the basis of the project is. This project it hinges on the idea of something called attitudinal inoculation. The idea being that if you expose somebody to a weakened form of an idea in the same way the body is exposed to a weakened form of a virus, they can develop resilience to that idea. Now, there's about 60 years of research in communication science showing that this is an effective means of helping people prevent being persuaded by these sorts of ideas. So the first phase of the project was meant to develop deliverables and trainings that help people develop their own inoculation messages. So in the years that we've worked so far, there's been 4 major real outcomes. Number one, we've developed this literature base around inoculation and disinformation that can be of use to stakeholders. And I know that literature is a boring word to politicians and to practitioners. So we've made this a way that's accessible to practitioners. One of the things I really want to do with this work is to make sure it's easily accessible and digestible by people that are going to use it. So it's been boiled down to its basest elements so that people can understand it. Second, we've developed reading lists for people so they can look at this information. But the 2 major hallmarks of the first phase are the trainings that have been undertaken and the workshop that we've undertaken. The training so far, I think we've conducted 3. 2 where we've trained stakeholders directly, and I think we've trained probably about 200 by now, stakeholders from around the country, in developing inoculation messages for specific threats that they face in their communities. So although my focus for my project is on the far right and disinformation specifically, different communities have different kinds of threats that face them. So I want to be able to train those communities to address those informational threats that face them specifically. So we've trained several individuals, 200 or so, in how to develop inoculation messages for those specific threats. For the project going into phase 2, we conducted this workshop where we had about, I guess, 30 of the world's foremost experts on right-wing extremism and disinformation, and identified some of the threats coming down the pipeline in terms of disinformation and the kind of violence that might come from the American far right, one of which, as I mentioned, was the LGBTQ threat. Building on that, we'll be conducting an experiment where we're testing inoculation against this very idea in areas around the country where this idea is starting to percolate based on searches in search engines that are completely anonymized. So we've achieved a lot of our foundational work. We conducted several trainings. We've identified these threats. And the last step is to test inoculation based on the threats we've identified.
Thank you, Dr. Braddock. Now recognize Ranking Member Mayer for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. A for effort,
Well,
please.
I really appreciate all the witnesses' testimonies today. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important meeting, or this important hearing on the subject. I'll start with Lieutenant Colonel Kalinsky. I appreciate you coming in from Michigan today, from the great state of Michigan, from the greatest state of Michigan. With all the grant funding that you received, the Michigan State Police Michigan Intelligence Operations Center, or MIOC, implemented their statewide Fusion Liaison Officer Program. Fusion Liaison Officer Program. The goal of the program, of course, is to provide training to law enforcement, first responders, and private sector partners across the state to enhance awareness and also strengthen collaboration. Now, since the implementation of this training, can you share how the information sharing and collaboration has improved between the key stakeholders in this space? What have you found to be best practices in information sharing, and how can other local communities implement similar processes to strengthen collaboration?
Thank you for your question. And we've only been able to get one of the 2 part-time contract analysts in place to date, and their focus has been mostly in the creation and updating of the educational materials for the Fusion Liaison Officer trainings and initial meetings with state and federal partners. We have numerous Fusion Liaison Officer training sessions that will occur with 3 coming up actually in August and September. And with the training session we had and future trainings, we expand our targeted violence and terrorism prevention ecosystem of stakeholders, which by its very nature fosters information sharing and collaboration through frequent discussions, interactions, and our product distribution. Personnel in the sessions not only get comfortable with Fusion Center and Fusion Liaison Officer personnel who they provide information, but they understand the process of information sharing and benefits of collaboration. After our first flow training or Fusion Liaison Officer training session, we did not see an increase in suspicious activity reports, but we did see an increase in requests for service. But we cannot say if this at this time is attributed to the flow training or some other factors, but we are going to continue to look at these impacts from our training sessions as we move forward. With over 7,000 individuals, and that's law enforcement, emergency management, or private sector partners who currently receive our daily information bulletins from our Fusion Center, and with the increased exposure to the flow program through our trainings, I am certain our information sharing and collaboration will continue to flourish and increase. And we also look to our stakeholders to help us continually identify how we can improve our collaboration and information sharing. We also have more interaction with agencies and personnel on the threat and mitigation of targeted violence and terrorism prevention through our biweekly meetings with state agencies who are interested in behavioral threat assessment teams. Additionally, by embedding our DHS CP3 coordinator into our Fusion Center, we have more direct and quicker access to DHS resources, as well as having our regional coordinators' expertise in implementing targeted violence and terrorism prevention programs. And lastly, we have engaged with our renowned experts on this topic from Michigan State University to collaborate with us and provide guidance as we move forward. As far as your question on best practices, first and foremost, providing actionable, relevant, and timely information to stakeholders. And then build a network of multiple disciplines that have regular meetings to engage with each other. Identify that central reporting mechanism and how the distribution of information should occur, discussing appropriate interventions, as well as hold joint training sessions that fosters trust and demonstrates the effectiveness of interagency and multidisciplinary collaboration. And then we continue to look at what has been done in Virginia, North Carolina, and recently Florida, who has shown the behavioral threat assessment management is a best path forward with, I believe it was a May 2007 study. So we will continue to look at our partner states to see what are the promising practices as we continue to move forward, sir.
And then just as a last question, Lieutenant Colonel Klinsky, you mentioned in your testimony the importance of protecting privacy, civil rights, civil liberties throughout the work of the behavioral threat assessment management team. Obviously in the state of Michigan, we saw just in recent months, the acquittal of 4 individuals who were accused of participating in a kidnapping plot against the governor, and is in the realm of domestic violence extremism, making sure we're protecting civil liberties. We're not getting to the point, which has been alleged, of conducting entrapment operations. Now, some of that obviously is a little bit more rightward than kind of the focus on the prevention side. But could you provide more details into that process and how your department ensures that in the course of doing their work, they're also protecting civil liberties, civil rights, and just the privacy of American citizens more broadly?
Yeah, I can provide a lot more information. I believe we have our Intelligence Operations Center policy privacy is a 6-page document that is posted online, and I can ensure that that gets sent to you. It is a public-facing document, but we take that very serious. We look at that all the time to ensure those protections are in place, as well as an agency. It is embedded in our official orders or policies to ensure that all members continually have those protections at the front of their mind. But I can provide you that document, sir, or the link to that document, if that's okay.
I appreciate it, Lieutenant Colonel, and Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I recognize Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Braddock, I'd like to ask a couple questions of you. One of the other witnesses, at least related, how much have you received in grants from DHS for this sort of research?
This particular grant was $568,000, I believe, in change, somewhere in that realm.
how about over the course of time? How much in total from DHS?
In terms of this grant or overall in my personal research?
Why don't you first do this grant and then overall?
This grant, I think we're about halfway through the money that we spent. And overall, DHS just add another $5,000 to it for a grant that I got in graduate school for my dissertation.
So about $500,000, give or take a few thousand. Is that what you're saying?
Give or take, yeah, I'd say somewhere between $550,000 and $580,000.
One thing you said in your testimony, and I saw it in the written testimony as well, is that you credit DHS for its program here for the use of, quote, measures of program effectiveness, close quote, and you say that's kind of rare in the field. And then you say, quote, because of this, the field is rife with pundits posing as professionals, close quote. I take note of that because I'm concerned about that, especially with the recent hullabaloo about the Disinformation Governance Board and the like, and the way I see that. But let me ask you about this. On May 16, you had a tweet thread out there that I took a look at addressing what you call, excuse me, a tweet thread addressing what you call stochastic terrorism. And I was looking into it. It's a term that's been bandied about the last 5 years or so, rough. I mean, it's been a little earlier than that, but not much, but 5 years in active use. And you describe it as, quote, a form of incited terrorism whereby a communicator has access to a platform and big audience. When the communicator uses coded language that promotes violence within an audience of millions, at least one is likely to interpret it as a call to arms. And then you go on to say, that's the end of your quote, but you say you really can't predict who, when, or where, but as a matter of probability, at least one person will view it that way and might act on it.
Correct.
So that's what you describe stochastic terrorism as. And then I mean, you're distinguish that from incitement, right? I mean, the law already recognizes that if you
Absolutely
call for violence immediately, that's incitement, that's not protected. But the line that Brandenburg versus US drew by the Supreme Court was, it's not incitement. You can even talk about violence, calling for violence. You can't call for immediate violence. That's incitement. Otherwise, it's protected. Isn't that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So then you go on in that tweet thread and you say in one that President Trump is a stochastic terrorist with respect to the January 6th riot at the Capitol, right?
Correct.
Okay. So he's a terrorist. And then you also say that with respect to the 2019 El Paso Walmart mass shooting of people of Hispanic descent, that President Trump was a stochastic terrorist of that event, right?
Correct. Among others, yes.
Okay, so let me say, and then you have a tweet here that says, ends with this, it says, well, let me just hold it up. It says, Carlson is a danger to U.S. domestic security. And you're talking about Tucker Carlson, right?
I am.
And you say, and your conclusion is that Tucker Carlson is a terrorist.
Stochastic terrorist. I distinguish between an active terrorist, someone who engages in violence, and a stochastic terrorist as the inciter, not meeting the legal definition for incitement.
Okay, it's not an insider in law, but in your definition, a stochastic terrorist, I guess I'll keep using that term. It's hard to say stochastic. It's a
I know, it's annoying.
term, right?
Yeah, it's a statistics term that I didn't come up with. The term stochastic terrorist came up, I think it emerged somewhere around 2011, 2012. I actually had a discussion with somebody earlier. I just did a podcast where I said I don't actually like the term stochastic terrorist because terrorism is an activity. What's that?
I'm not a big fan either. Let me go on with that. So let me just ask this. Is when, you're familiar with the Chuck Schumer statement about Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. Is Chuck Schumer a stochastic terrorist?
I would say that one walks the line. There's another one from the left. I forget who it was that said it, but somebody on the left, maybe it was last year, talked about getting in the face and getting aggressive with police or something along those lines. I forget that.
Like Maxine Waters. How about that? Let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up, and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. Is she a stochastic terrorist?
I've made that argument.
Is Joe Biden, after the attempt on Kavanaugh's life, said immediately that evening that he went on late night comedy and predicted a mini revolution if the Supreme Court overturns Roe. Is President Biden a stochastic terrorist?
I wouldn't think that meets the line, no. But you mentioned a point earlier too, where it all relates to data and collecting data as to whether one connects to the other. And that's the research I'm trying to conduct now. I'm actually not related to the project I'm testifying on now, but another research project I'm working on, is looking at the connection between the two. And something I think you're alluding to, but I want to distinguish, is stochastic terrorism isn't illegal. Just because the term terrorism isn't doesn't mean that it's illegal. Incitement is illegal. That doesn't mean the phenomena doesn't exist.
Well, that's what I'm concerned about. So and I don't know if the chairman might indulge me just a little bit since it doesn't look like we got a long train of people, but let me just ask this.
Go
The
ahead.
end of that tweet thread I was talking about says, one more thing. I'm a firm believer that 1A, you're referring to the First Amendment, is sacrosanct. But
Mhm.
there is a debate that needs to be had about whether and how stochastic terrorism is allowed to occur.
Sure.
So you're talking about some restriction that by your own definition is different than where the Supreme Court is about what's protected by the First Amendment, aren't you?
It's not a legal restriction I'm arguing for. The arguments I make for against stochastic terrorism are building of resilience against that particular strategic communication, because it is a strategic form of communication. Although it's not legal incitement, it can be argued to relate to the behaviors that take place later. And though it's not illegal, it doesn't mean that we can't do counter persuasion against it. It's a strategic communication device like any other.
So sort of last line, that last point that could take me back to that tweet I showed you.
Sure.
Have you been paid taxpayer dollars by DHS to study Tucker Carlson as a stochastic terrorist?
No.
Okay. Has that been a feature of your research? Have you researched Tucker Carlson?
I mean, informally, for my own edification, I have.
Sufficient to the point that you were willing to say on Twitter that he's a stochastic terrorist for the Buffalo massacre, right?
I'm willing to say it on congressional record, yes.
But you haven't researched it to quantify anything or to come up with a statistical relationship.
There are research
Mr.
studies
Bishop,
that I haven't done that argue that.
Thank you,
I'm
Mr.
gonna
Chairman. I
cut-
appreciate
cut
your
you off.
indulgence.
And we're gonna have a second set of questions if you so wish, but
And
Let
if
me
I,
get to Ms.
can I make one
Harshburg.
can I make one last statement, Chairman?
Go ahead. This is a good discussion. Go
No,
ahead.
it is. And
Make
Mr.
your
Bishop, these are the exact discussions that I'm talking about in that tweet thread that I want to take place. The fact that these discussions can actually take place and we can find where a line is, or if there is a line, that debate needs to take place. And that's what I enjoy about these sorts of things. It's not meant to mean that somebody should be arrested for saying something, but these sorts of words do have implications. We have 100 years of research showing that words have implications. And even if they're not legally actionable, they need to be talked about. And these are the discussions that I like to have with both sides.
The chairman's been
Thank you,
gracious
Dr.
to allow me to go on, and I look forward to maybe taking it up with you for a little further if I get another chance, Mr. Braddock. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, you got it. Ms. Harshberger, welcome. You get a little bit over 5 minutes. How's that? Go ahead.
Hey, I'm good. I'm good to go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being here today. I have a question about how you measure the program effectiveness. And, from what I understand, DHS defines targeted violence as any international act or intentional act against a pre-identified target based on that target's perceived identity or affiliation that is intended to intimidate, coerce, or generate publicity about the perpetrator's grievance. And I guess my question to any of the panel is, how do you measure the program effectiveness and performance standards, and how do you integrate that into this TVT grant program? And how did having a performance standards and accountability measure help you evaluate your project and improve the effectiveness of your projects? Because how do you know if something's successful if you don't have outcomes and measures put in place to measure that program? And that's to anyone on the panel.
I'll go very quickly because I don't want to take everybody's time here. In mine, there's several measures of effectiveness. The primary one being the inoculation actual treatments. You can pre and post test people to see how they feel about a particular topic before and after they receive the inoculation treatments. And that's the plan with the experimental phase of the overall project. In terms of the trainings that I've done and those sorts of things, we've actually conducted surveys of people who've gone through the trainings, who have intentions about inoculation, who understand it, who believe it would be useful for their specific communities. And we can actually do statistical analyses of their responses to see whether there's improvement in what they feel about the actual strategy moving forward. And those have all shown positive improvement. In terms of the second part, the what I mentioned earlier, the actual inoculation treatments, those are based on controlled experimentation, which in social science is the gold standard, but hard to come across. So there's several different measures that I use. And again, one of the, I think the cornerstones of the TVTP program is that it demands these kinds of evaluations as we do these sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else have a comment?
I,
Um,
oh,
go
I
ahead.
thought you were trying to yield, Diane. I'm sorry.
No, it's
thought-
okay, Dan.
So I was going to talk about, so for our programs, we actually use pre and post questionnaires and various feedback and survey instruments very specifically to measure the shift in knowledge and willingness to act based on information that they have received. And so, for example, for our TACO program, where we started off with is, and this is when you mentioned, right, like the definitions of who knows what the definitions even mean. So we asked the participants that. And it turns out that 94% of the participants had heard the terms domestic terrorism and targeted violence, and yet only 25% knew what they meant. Same thing, we asked about public health approach. What is that? And barely 20% knew of the concept, and about 30% had never even heard of it before. So you can imagine, right, that when we're talking about what's targeted violence, what's domestic terrorism, what's public health approach, vast majority of our participants had no idea. And these were the elected officials and the leaders who are there to protect us. So there's this, for us, it was this huge awareness, that recognition that awareness is essential. And without the awareness, there is no way of actually doing prevention or having a public health approach or any of this stuff if people don't even know what it is they're trying to do. So that was, for us, was important. We also found through our training that after our training, and I mentioned this earlier also, is that we found after our training, over 85% of the participants agreed or strongly agreed that their self-perception of the skills to actually be upstanders and knowing what to do in various types of situations and running through case studies and role plays, they found that they were actually willing to do it. And this was an increase of over 37%. And that's a huge increase because we're talking about, 6 hours live training, 2 hours online, right? So a total of 8 hours virtual training. It's 1 day of training, which caused this huge increase in their willingness, in the skills of that they had. And then the other thing which we were checking against is their willingness to act. Because it's one thing to say, oh, I know what to do, but the question is, am I willing to do it? And there we also saw that after our training, over about 75%, 73% were willing to actually engage with friends and family. And when we're talking about upstanders, right, in this case, we're not talking about here's a random stranger. This is not about the DHS, like see something, say something. When we're talking about upstanders is how can people who you know within your own network recognize if an individual is going through any sort of distress, there's any crisis in their life, and then how to get them help way before they actually are trying to get towards violence. And so for that, so you want the friends and family, you want our own networks to be aware of, hey, something's happening, but what to do about it. And there we saw that again, post-training, there was an increase. It was almost a 20% increase.
Okay.
So we did, yeah. So we are absolutely using metrics.
Yeah,
we have
that's
to.
important. And I know that, do you want to say something, sir, Mr. Paul?
Thank you, Representative Harshberger. I did. One of the things I think that's interesting about the REACH program, which stands for Reconciliation, Education, and Counseling Crimes of Hate, is we're dealing specifically with criminal defendants who are being placed on probation and are going to be completing the program as a term of probation. I think there's two interesting things that we can talk about here when we're talking about metrics. The easiest metric is going to be whether or not they further offend. So we are seeking to get permission to track them for 5 years to see whether or not they commit an offense. And then if they did commit an offense, did they target the same group that they targeted the first time? It's not so much recidivism in terms of global recidivism, but targeted and selected recidivism that this program is about. And I do feel that having the ability to check their criminal record is a clear, quantifiable, empirical factor that we can look at. The other thing I'd like to mention to this committee is this program is making a deliberate effort to bring victim reconciliation into the arena. And when I say that, one of the target participants that's going to be working with us, he was white. He was with his wife. She was white, and they ended up all over the national press because they came across an African American man and his ethnic wife, and they got out of the car and they started saying things like "Only white lives matter." This was all being recorded by the victim's wife. What's interesting here is even though the court only has jurisdiction over the defendant, the individual who struck the truck with the shovel, after talking to him and his attorney and saying, we would like you to participate in this program, he and his wife have both agreed to participate in victim reconciliation with the victims. And in this instance, the victims, the man and his wife, have agreed to sit down with the defendants, and well, a singular defendant. What's interesting, I think, there is, metrics. I mean, when we try to make it quantifiable can be very difficult, but qualitatively here, having the victim and the defendant sit down to talk about what happened, for the defendant to be given the opportunity to apologize and for the victim to be given the opportunity to accept, goes way beyond just the defendant and the victim. It involves the entire community, whether it's a Jewish community that's involved, whether it's the African American community that's involved, whatever community it is. So I would like to point that out. Sometimes there are qualitative factors that are difficult to measure, but they do yield, I think, significant results. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Thank you very much. And any other members that wish to ask their 5 minutes of questions? Seeing none, would you all be interested in the second round of questions?
I would, Mr. Chairman.
Good with me, Mr.
So would I. Mr. Meyer, okay, let's move to a second round, and I'll start with a set of questions here. I'm gonna try to hold to 5 minutes. I'm gonna ask Lieutenant Colonel Kalinsky a question or thoughts, if I may. Lieutenant Colonel, you are running part of the Fusion Center of Michigan. We here in Orange County, California also have a Fusion Center, and they do some great things, from cyber to intel, trying to prevent some bad stuff from happening. One of the concerns that I've heard from Fusion Centers is that communication not be as good as it should be, and that sometimes communication is from the feds down, but not, or I should say, from the bottom up and not from the bottom back to the Fusion Centers. Any thoughts?
I think we've seen over the years that the communication ebbs and flows. I will say I've been doing this since right after 9/11, and we are light years ahead of where we were. I think everyone would agree with that. But I do feel that the communication is effective. We can always do better. I also think the communication between the Fusion Centers throughout our nation, to include the work that the National Fusion Center Association is doing to keep everyone together, is also very, very good, sir. But we always can do better. And sometimes we're limited by the information that gets pushed up to us that's down at the local level. And that's what kind of delays some of the actions that we take.
Can you elaborate on that specific point, please?
With the last one, sir, about getting the information pushed up. Yeah, so this is exactly why we want to get our Fusion Liaison Officer program in place, because that's going to put people who are trained in the process of identifying information that is relevant to the Fusion Centers, so then we can look at that information and say, yes, we need to do further on this, or no, that's constitutionally protected, there's nothing more to do here. But we have to get that information pushed up to us, whether it's from our Fusion Liaison Officers or through the general public, through the See Something, Say Something. In Michigan, we have an OK to Say school tip line, and that's what generates our suspicious activity reports.
Sir, if I may interrupt you, you just said something interesting, which is, if you have information that's constitutionally protected in the context of a possible clear and present danger, how do you resolve that issue?
Well, if it's a clear and present danger, I guess I would question what is protected in that regard. A lot of time, not a lot of times, sometimes we might get information that somebody may not. They could even have just a beef with their neighbor, and they push that up to our fusion center. That's not something for us to act on. That's very different than information that we actually look at has a criminal nexus, and we need to look through more.
So in a situation where you do have that balancing act of constitutionally protected activity versus the possibility of something terrible coming to happen, you do have a mechanism to resolve that and hopefully make the right decision.
Yes, our fusion center personnel, as well as the fusion center personnel throughout our nation, are trained very well, and very much understand what they can and can't do based on the Code of Federal Regulations.
Now, we look back at 911 and because of the misinformation, the silos that we operated for 911, Homeland Security was created to eliminate a lot of those silos. And you just said that things could always be better. And I guess my open question to you would be, how do we make sure that we continue to improve on our communication? Because I am bothered. You all do a great job. You've got thousands and thousands of fact data points, and you've got to figure out what this stuff means. But any thoughts on how we can specifically improve what you do within the constitutional confines of assuring that we prevent the next horrific thing from happening?
Yeah, I think we continue to leave egos at the door, and I think we continue the open dialogue and collaboration, not only with local, state, and federal partners, but also with our private sector and non-governmental organizations, as well as those that are responsible for overseeing civil rights, civil liberties, and our constitutional protections. We all have to be engaged with each other.
Looks like my time expired, so what I'm going to do is hand it over to our ranking member Meyer for 5 minutes of questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Correa. And again, I appreciate the second round of questionings. I know Ms. Khan was talking about just the overall funding levels and some of those frustrations and concerns, that the money can only go so far. And obviously, some of the goal of grant programs are to kind of spur additional insights and information, and hearings like the one we're having today, where we can evaluate what potentially that number needs to be. But I guess, again, to Lieutenant Colonel Kolensky, the training that's been provided by the newly created Fusion Liaison Officer Program, how, in your view, has that helped deter acts of terrorism or violent threats in your communities? And as a corollary, how would an increase in funding allow you to more efficiently achieve the desired outcomes of your program? Please, I'd be curious your thoughts.
It's a great question, sir. We've only had the one initial training, and I will say that one individual I know of, and I'm sure there may have been others from the initial training, did already provide information to our field analysts to follow up on. And this was a result of providing not only the training, but providing attendees field analyst locations and contact information that facilitates that reporting, collaboration, and investigation. While nothing came from this report, it does demonstrate that the training is providing an effective identification and reporting process. To your point, or your question on increased funding, that allows us to appropriately resource gaps we continue to identify as we move through this process. And this could include increasing staffing for tip lines and our watch desk personnel, more fusion liaison officers at the local and state level, statewide implementation of our behavioral threat assessment management teams from the local and state level. We at least want one per state police district. Provide trainings for additional skilled workers in mental health. That is a continual gap. Host more training sessions on preventing targeted violence and terrorism prevention, and increase community engagement and education. Once the behavioral threat assessment management team or teams are in place, we also need to make sure that we have the bandwidth to handle the requests for service effectively and efficiently, because we know with training and more community engagement and education, we will get more or an increase in requests for service.
Yeah, and obviously the question of ultimate responsibility and funding source between state and federal is something for us to kind of discuss in a bit more detail in other fora. But I guess kind of turning back to what Ms. Khan was talking about earlier, and I would welcome if anyone else wants to address this as well, more than happy. But what we've heard from many in the community that applying for grants across the board, not necessarily under DHS, but that can be a very cumbersome process. I would just be curious for your own experiences. How challenging was the application for TVTP funding, and how did you find that relative to other grant processes that you've undertaken throughout your other kind of federal interactions?
So from our perspective, the TVTP grant was fairly standard. This is not very different from any other federal grant, even state level grants. The requirements for what you have to write is actually not too bad. So the process itself, I think you just, look, they have instructions and you have to follow it. And anytime you're applying for any federal or any government grant, you have to follow the instructions. And as long as you're doing it, and they have like timelines, make sure you do this 2 weeks ahead of time, a week ahead, etc. As long as you're following it, you're all good. So I think there's just a place where you have to, dot your I's and cross your T's because you're dealing with the government. And I think it's not just once the grant process is easy. Reality is that once you get the funding, you have like 200 pages of compliance. But that's just the federal process, and you have to make sure
I
that
see
all
a lot
the
of heads,
systems.
a lot of heads
Right.
nodding on the compliance front. Yeah.
So it just is the fact of life when you're dealing with any sort of government money. And no different from anything else.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, I see my time is close to expiry, so I yield back. And thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I recognize Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes, sir. 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. Let's go back, Mr. Braddock, to what we were talking about, stochastic terrorism. And
Let's do it.
and your paper says that your testimony says, at present, I am working on a research project geared towards understanding how disinformation and conspiracies perpetuated by far-right extremists persuade their intended audiences. And more importantly, how we can prevent these audiences from engaging in violence in support of those conspiracies and disinformation. So, so is the concept of stochastic terrorism is part of that theory, right?
Not necessarily.
Has
Not
any of
necessarily.
your research for DHS addressed the concept of stochastic terrorism?
No.
Okay. Let's talk about it though just a little further. So
course.
stochastic, from what I read, means random.
Well, random, although guaranteed to occur. Statistics means out of statistics, it means it's random where and when it will occur, but it will reliably occur. The best way to explain it.
I mean, if something's random, it happens without regard to a causal factor. But when you talk about stochastic terrorism, you're attributing to a Donald Trump or a Tucker Carlson.
Well, what you said is not true. Well, you can attribute something to random. If you remember in biology class, or biology class is the best example to use it. When I was in biology class in high school, you would take a petri dish and you would sneeze into the petri dish, and then you would close the petri dish. And then 3 days later, bacteria would grow somewhere. You can't predict when and where, but it would grow somewhere. That's attributable to the sneeze. A better example, maybe not in biology class, if you're sitting on your front porch in North Carolina, right? North Carolina, and you're looking out on the horizon. I know it gets hot in North Carolina. I've been to Chapel Hill plenty of times. And you see dark clouds rolling in on your porch. You know lightning is going to strike somewhere. You can't predict when and where, but it's going to strike somewhere. That's attributable to the heat meeting the cold.
So, okay. So, I mean, we're off far afield pretty much. And I'll leave for the moment for somebody else who's watching to decide whether there's a concept that's different between randomness and something caused by an efficient cause. But let's leave that aside for one moment. Let me just get a couple more examples. You said you had no hesitancy to conclude that President Trump's a stochastic terrorist with respect to January 6th and with respect to the El Paso shooter. You said that Tucker Carlson is a stochastic terrorist with respect to the Buffalo attack. But then you said you thought Chuck Schumer walked the line when he said what he said about you won't know what hit you, addressed to two Supreme Court justices. Why does that walk the line?
Because I don't know what hit you isn't as direct as there are people replacing you in your country. or isn't as direct as we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and then not walk down Pennsylvania Avenue with those people.
Okay.
These are implied directives.
Let me keep going. Maxine Waters, I started to talk about that where she said, wherever these people show up, you push back on them, you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere. That's not stochastic terrorism. Is that what I understand?
Did you ignore what I said earlier? I said, yes, that would be.
Oh, you said Maxine Waters is a stochastic terrorist. Okay.
I said these are
how about-
incidents of stochastic terrorism.
How about this? Eric Swalwell, well, let me ask you, I'm going to ask you one more. Eric Swalwell says the Republicans won't stop with banning abortion. They want to ban interracial marriage. Is he a stochastic terrorist?
No, not out of that quote.
Nothing would inspire anybody to do anything. Let me ask this, was Frank James, the guy in the Buffalo, New York subway, who shot in the subway, and I don't remember what all else he did, was he inspired by stochastic terrorism of, say, Black Lives Matter and critical race theorists?
I'm not familiar with the Frank James case. You're gonna have to explain to me what happened and the quotes you're attributing to his actions.
You're not aware of the Brooklyn subway attack that just happened about 2 or 3 months ago?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
All right. Let me see. Okay. When Joe Biden said, I think I may have done that one. Hillary Clinton on the Dobbs leak. This decision will kill and subjugate women. What an utter disgrace. Is that stochastic terrorism?
There's no implied directive. If you can't see the difference between mentioning something that will occur in an implied directive, like we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, one implies that there is some justifiable motion toward an action. And I could talk about the theory that underpins why my argument is that these certain cases are stochastic terrorism versus others aren't.
Our time probably doesn't allow for that. I got 20 seconds. Let me just try to get at it one other way. Is calling Republicans white supremacists itself a form of stochastic terrorism?
No.
How about
just like calling Democrats communists and socialists isn't stochastic terrorism.
All right, the woman who runs the account on Twitter, Libs of TikTok, Washington Post said, identified her, said she was a domestic terrorist, and she's had a spate of death threats as a consequence. Is Washington Post a stochastic terrorist?
Through identifying her, no. It has to be an implied
Well, that last one, Mr. Bishop, we're out of time, but go ahead, Dr. Braddock, go ahead and finish answering that one, please.
I can do this all day, Mr. Chairman. But that last one,
Okay.
there needs to be an implied directive towards what's happening. And again, I'm more than happy to send information to the panel and to Mr. Bishop. And like I said, I like having these conversations. I know it's kind of a gotcha game, but I enjoy having these conversations because ultimately it means less violence from both sides. But I'll be happy to send supplemental material. I'm sorry,
Dr. Braddock, after the hearing, you're more than welcome to supply written answers to any of the questions that the members.
I really actually want to, and for Mr. Bishop, because I know we don't have time, but I'll send you the materials that link implied messaging to action, so you have a better idea where I'm coming from, because it is kind of a lecture, and I know that government types don't like lectures.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Look forward to getting that information. Now I'm going to go back, and Ms. Titus has joined us. Is that correct, Ms. Dina Titus?
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Adam, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you. I apologize for being late. Today is election day in Nevada.
That's what I figured. I heard you were busy today, so I want to give 5 minutes, if you can, to ask the panel of witnesses some questions. Welcome, ma'am.
Well, thank you. As you know, we are currently involved in an increased domestic threat environment. And this is due to a number of factors, but one thing that's been cited is the forthcoming decision by the Supreme Court on abortion. And so I wrote a letter. I was joined by some members of this committee and the chairman and Chairman Thompson to the Secretary of Homeland Security, asking them to please remain vigilant and come up with a plan to deal with this, kind of get ahead of the game instead of reacting. But I'd like to go back to Dr. Braddock to talk about this some with his research to counter disinformation campaigns. One of the big ones from some of the right-wing groups is great replacement theory. And that's being used in the context of the abortion issue. So all those things kind of come together. I wonder if you could talk about how we can prevent online forums from perpetuating untruths, or how we can tackle the situation if we are expecting a rise in dangerous attacks. Could you just share some of your research or findings on those kind of topics?
Sure, absolutely. And Mr. Bishop will like this. This applies to both the left and the right. Inoculation is useful for any kind of ideology in my research that advocates for violence. The idea is to prevent, ultimately, violence that perpetuates from a violent extremist ideology. So I mentioned earlier kind of what inoculation is, attitudinal inoculation. It's a strategic counter-persuasive strategy whereby there are two major elements to it. In one, you essentially warn a target who hasn't been exposed to an idea before or has been exposed to it minimally that there is a third actor out there who's trying to use them for their own devices and may try to get them to engage in behaviors they might not otherwise engage in. Being Americans, especially, Americans very much value their own autonomy. So when we think somebody's going to try to persuade us, we really don't like it. And we kind of become resolute in our beliefs and attitudes. And that's what I really like about it, is because you can approach people, and I have approached people and said, listen, I may not agree with your political points of view. That's okay. You can have whatever beliefs and attitudes you have. I just want to make sure you don't engage in violence. And there are people out there who would have you engage in violence. That's step one. Step two is to present them with counter arguments against what they're going to encounter. Now, my research and 60 years of research in other contexts has shown that when you do this, there's a couple of pretty cool things that happen. Number one, they experience what's called reactance in response to that. So what they do, I guess the best way to explain this is, if you've ever been in a store and you just want to window shop and somebody comes up to you and wants to sell you something, that weird, gross feeling where you want them to just go away, that's what they experience when they encounter the propaganda. So they get angry and they counter argue against it. That's number one. Number two is that they attribute less credibility to the person that might try to persuade them down the line. They think they're less credible. And what I found in my research, and the most important thing for me, is number three, they report significantly less intention to support that group or that person with violence. They might still ideologically believe whatever they want to believe, but they report less intention to get violent on the back of it. So I argue, and I have argued, that one of the key things that we need with respect to disinformation in the US and elsewhere is some comprehensive media literacy in schools to help kids understand when they're encountering information that might be false. It's not their fault. It's not school districts' fault. It's not the government's fault that we don't have this. It's just that digital technologies have advanced so quickly, and Web 2.0 technologies where people can create their own content has advanced so quickly, we haven't been able to keep up with it. So we need to arm people who don't have the capacity for identifying true versus false information from anywhere. They don't have that capacity, and we need to help them with that. And I think that inoculation, at least from the research that I've shown thus far, would benefit that. Now, there are boundaries around inoculation, like there is with any counter-persuasion strategy or any communication strategy. But that's what research is for, and that's what we're parsing it out.
And the Department of Homeland Security is paying attention to this? And there are grants for this, or how can we pursue that suggestion?
I hope they are. They gave me more than $500,000 to research it, so I hope they're paying attention. But
I don't want your findings just to go on a shelf somewhere.
No, I'm actually, that's one of the things that we mentioned John Wilder a couple of times, my program manager. One of the things that we're very cognizant of is this needs to reach the people that need to use it. So I've conducted a couple of trainings already with people all around the country, right wing, left wing, and everything in between, to help them develop inoculation messages in their communities against the specific disinformation problems that they face. And from what I've learned from those individuals after they've undergone the training, they've reported back to me that they intend on using it, and they've talked about the different kinds of disinformation they face. And it's not just coming from what my focus is on this project being the right wing. They see it coming from all over the place, and they want to help prevent people from being taken in by it, and most importantly, engaging in violence on behalf of it. I'm interested in preventing violence, beliefs, and attitudes. That's, people can believe whatever they want. These inoculation trainings are meant to help people, to help others, prevent them from engaging in violence on behalf of any kind of disinformation they encounter.
Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to come back, Mr. Chairman. Learned a lot.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and good luck today in your election.
Thank you.
Ms. Harshberger, are you there? Would you like to ask 5 minutes of questions, ma'am. Going once. Going twice. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, the members for their questions. That was a good hearing today. Members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond to those questions expeditiously in writing. The chair reminds members the committee record will remain open for another 10 days, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all.